What if I told you that hidden beneath one of the world's most sacred sites lies a place not meant for humans, but for entities who once stood in the presence of the divine? Can you fathom a prison where the barriers aren't made of rock, but of mysteries, belief, and dread? What if I disclosed that its inhabitants are not bound by physical restraints, but by the decisions they made in an era long erased from memory? Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient tales, buried terrors, and otherworldly conflicts spring to life. If you're fascinated by the hidden corners of myth, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on every epic tale. Descent. Music. The elevator seemed to plunge endlessly. I glanced at my watch repeatedly, each second intensifying the tightness in my chest as I sank deeper beneath Vatican City than any visitor could dream. Beside me, Cardinal Armand stood quiet yet authoritative, clutching a leather satchel as though it held the key to the universe's oldest enigmas. His fingers drummed on the handle in a rhythm that demanded attention. "The previous warden didn't endure long," he murmured finally. When I asked what became of him, he replied, "Early retirement," his voice devoid of warmth, his gaze fixed forward. My thoughts churned. I'd been recruited for this mission after years managing high-security prisons in the US, but the briefing files gave no clue about what awaited below. When the elevator finally stopped, the metal doors parted to reveal a curving hallway lined with glowing screens. Data flickered across them, pulse rates, temperatures, metrics I couldn't interpret. It felt less like entering a prison and more like stepping into a fortified laboratory. A man in a white coat appeared, his face pale from years without sunlight. He extended his hand with a steady grip. "Dr. Elias," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Cardinal." Armand simply gestured for him to proceed. "Show him the observation deck first." As we walked, I noticed the thick glass windows on the doors we passed. Some rooms were empty, white walls, and basic furniture. Others contained faint movement that made my stomach tighten. "Cell 7, Ellis said, stopping before a door. "Our oldest resident, we call her Nemesis." Through the glass, I saw a woman seated cross-legged on the floor, long black hair cascading down her back. As she traced delicate lines across the surface with her finger. "She's been here since the day this place opened. She spends every hour drawing equations. Some have solved problems scholars couldn't crack for centuries, but she won't explain any of them." I watched, hypnotized by her deliberate, fluid motions. "Have you ever tried connecting with her, building trust?" I asked. Elias's expression darkened. "The previous warden did. By the end, he claimed they were sharing memories with him. The Vatican considered that dangerous." We moved on. In another cell, a man folded intricate paper stars with surgical precision. Elias called him Bronick. Each star was perfectly symmetrical, a six-pointed shape with subtle variations. "We've tried preserving them," Elias explained. "But everyone dissolves at midnight. It doesn't matter how or where they're kept. They simply vanish." Bronick looked up suddenly, his dark eyes locking with mine as he lifted one of his fragile creations to the glass. My skin Prickled. They know we're watching, I whispered. Always, Elias replied. Gravely. Some acknowledge it. Others never even glance our way. Further along, we passed a figure who had stood completely motionless for years. A young boy who read the same floating book over, and a woman whose eyes never opened. Each was stranger than the last, and yet none displayed hostility. I couldn't shake the question hammering at my chest. Why were they here? The observation deck offered a panoramic view of the entire facility. From there, I could see multiple cells at once, each resident lost in their routine. Armand handed me a thick folder. 3 residents have begun changing their behavior. We need your assessment. The first report was about Raphael, a being who had started humming at the same hour every day. The sound, the file said, resonated through the entire complex. Despite the soundproofing, it's affecting the others, Elias murmured. We just don't know how. That night, I couldn't sleep. My new office felt cold and foreign, the metal cabinets full of forgotten files. In the bottom drawer, I found a small journal left by the warden before me. Sparse notes, but unsettling. Neoris drew something new today. Not equations, a map. Bronick folded a different shape. The humming began. And then the last line, scribbled with urgency. I don't think they're prisoners. I stared at those words long. After the lights dimmed, something about this place felt wrong. These beings weren't violent. They weren't trying to escape. They simply existed in quiet, relentless rhythm. But the questions in my mind multiplied as I walked the halls. During my first solo inspection, one of the women had transformed her cell into a mural of extraordinary beauty. When she saw me at her window, she smiled faintly and pointed to a painted version of herself. Wings unfurled, surrounded by faces gazing upward in awe. My breath caught. She wasn't painting fantasy. She was painting memory. And then came the cell with Uriel, a man who did nothing but stand at his window watching. When I approached, he pressed his hand to the glass, and instinctively I mirrored the gesture. For a heartbeat, I felt it. A pulse of sorrow, of hope, of something older than the earth itself. Finally, I reached the last door. Raphael sat on the bed, his eyes calm, waiting. When he began to hum, the melody didn't just fill the corridor, it filled me. I heard harmonies layered like voices across time, as if 1,000 souls were singing through him. One by one, the others reacted. Nemais stopped drawing. Bronick froze mid-fold. The woman who hadn't moved in years opened her eyes. And when the humming ended, silence crashed down like a weight, leaving me shaken. That night, I wrote my first log entry. Day 1. Raphael's humming isn't random. It's communication. But as I signed my name, a chill gripped me. Because deep down I already knew this wasn't a prison. It was something far more dangerous. We are not what you think, Nemeris had once whispered to the previous warden, a line now etched into the final page of his journal. One day you will understand why we chose to stay. Whispers. I woke the next morning with the echo of Raphael's melody still humming in the back of my mind. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a vibration that seemed to crawl beneath my skin. I shook it off and forced myself to focus on the day's tasks. A thick incident report lay on my desk, the letters blurring as fatigue made my eyes burn. Nemo Rice had changed her behavior during the night. According to the guard who discovered it, she had stopped her endless equations and written a phrase across the floor of her cell. The message was clear and deliberate. The warden has questions. My breath caught as I read it. That was exactly what I had been thinking before I fell asleep. The cells were soundproofed, the protocols flawless. But how could she have known? I called Dr. Ellis immediately. He arrived within minutes, his face paler than usual as he examined the photographs taken before the message disappeared in the nightly reset. She's never written words, he murmured, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Only formulas. This is new. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. If she could read my thoughts, what else could she do? It's not about sound, Elias continued. We've learned they can communicate in ways we can't fully measure. What she did last night proves she's aware of you specifically. I decided then to speak with her directly. It was a risk, but something told me avoiding her would be worse. Elias hesitated but agreed, warning that the previous warden's downfall had begun with long conversations. I didn't care. The interview room was small and sterile. A table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. When the guards brought Neoris in, she moved with a quiet grace, her dark hair trailing like a shadow. She sat across from me without resistance, her eyes intelligent but unreadable. Thank you for agreeing to speak, I began, unsure how to address her. I've been waiting, she said simply, her voice soft yet firm. It was the first time I had heard it, and it carried a weight that silenced every question in my mind. Waiting for what? I asked. She folded her hands, tilting her head slightly. For someone to ask the right question? My pulse quickened. We stripped humanity of its right to struggle, to learn from failure. That is why we fell. Her confession left me silent. So, you're here by choice? I finally asked. By agreement, she corrected. We are not prisoners. We are reminders. Cautionary tales about what happens when power is misused, even for kindness. My thoughts raced as I considered her words. It all aligned. Their calm routines, their lack of resistance, the intricate creations that seemed to hold deeper meaning. And now I asked. Now we wait, she said, her voice distant. Until humanity proves it. Understands, until someone realizes we are not the answer. There was a quiet authority in her tone that made me hesitate to press further. I ended the session only because I feared the pull of her presence, the same trap that had consumed the warden before me. But even as I walked her back to her cell, I knew the conversation had only deepened my questions. Later that day, I gathered Elias and the senior guards for a briefing. We've documented unusual behavior. I began laying out the evidence, Nemesi's message, the synchronized changes in sleep patterns, and Raphael's humming that had increased in duration. This isn't random. They're responding to each other. Captain Mara, a hardened guard with decades in the facility, raised an eyebrow. With respect, sir, nothing they do is predictable. Unusual is normal here. I shook my head. No, this is different. This feels coordinated. Elias leaned forward, concern etched in his features. What are you suggesting? I hesitated before speaking. I think we're missing something fundamental about why they're here. We need to understand their purpose before we can judge their behavior. My statement was met with tense silence, broken only by Mara's quiet warning. That's exactly how Patterson started. But I couldn't ignore the growing pattern. I requested interviews with other residents, beginning with Bran, Raphael, and the boy known in the files as Gabriel. Elias frowned, reminding me that extended interactions had been discouraged for years. It's safer to observe, he said. I stood firm. Observation isn't enough. If these beings are planning something, I need to know. The words tasted hollow, though deep down, I didn't believe they were planning an escape. What haunted me was the idea that they might be waiting for something far greater, and that I was already part of it. That night, I walked the silent halls alone. Nemaris was back to her equations, her focus unbroken. Bronick folded his paper stars with infinite patience. Raphael sat on his bed, humming softly, the sound vibrating in my chest even through layers of steel and glass. As I passed Gabriel's cell, I saw him sitting cross-legged on his bed, the same book hovering effortlessly before his eyes. He looked up and met my gaze, and for the first time he smiled. You're starting to see, he said. Revelations. Bren was the first I interviewed. He entered the small room without hesitation, his calm demeanor unsettling. He sat across from me, his hands clasped neatly on the table as if waiting for me to begin. I asked about his origami, those intricate stars that vanished each midnight. He smiled faintly, though his eyes held no amusement. Each piece represents a solution, he said. Clean energy, faster travel, the curing of sicknesses. Answers humanity has been searching for. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. Then why do they disappear? Brannock's gaze hardened. Because knowledge without wisdom becomes a weapon. We create, but we must not allow you to take it before you are ready. The dissolution ensures that. His voice was calm, yet it carried an authority that silenced any protest I might have had. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that every action inside the facility had purpose. Raphael was different. He entered the room with the serenity of someone who carried no fear. When I asked about the humming, his eyes softened as though the question itself brought him peace. It's a form of balance, he explained. It maintains our connection to one another, reminding us of what we are and why we wait. The longer I hum, the closer we are to the end of our waiting, my breath caught. And how do you know the waiting is almost over? He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Because you are here, he said simply. Because you ask questions rather than enforced silence. Change is near. We can feel it. His words lingered in my mind long after the interview ended, echoing with the same quiet conviction as Neoris's revelations. Something was shifting, and I was at the center of it. Gabriel, the boy with the floating book, was the most striking. He carried himself with the composure of someone far older than his appearance suggested. When I asked why he read the same book repeatedly, he smiled with an understanding I couldn't fathom. Because it reminds me why we fell, he said, holding the novel gently as it hovered between us. It speaks of moral courage, of doing what is right, even when it is difficult. We thought we were brave when we interfered in human lives, but we were afraid. Afraid to let you face pain and failure. Afraid to let you grow on your own. I asked what would happen when the waiting ended. He placed the book carefully on the table. That depends on humanity. If you've learned the value of struggle, we will move on to our next purpose. If not, we remain. His voice carried no judgment, only quiet certainty. I left the interviews with a growing sense of unease. Their answers aligned too perfectly with what Nemoris had already told me. They weren't prisoners, and they never had been. Their presence here was voluntary, part of a larger plan I still didn't fully understand. That night, I pored over every file in my office, searching for evidence the Vatican might have overlooked. The documents confirmed what I had begun to suspect. These beings had been here for decades, some 4 centuries, and in all that time they had shown no signs of aggression. Their contributions, mathematical formulas, artistic works, melodies had subtly guided humanity forward through intermediaries. Yet the Vatican's official records still framed them as dangerous captives, a narrative carefully maintained. The contradiction gnawed at me, making it impossible to sleep. On the third night, the dreams began again. They weren't like ordinary dreams. They felt vivid, like memories that didn't belong to me. I saw cities falling into ruin, oceans swallowing entire coastlines, and wars that left nothing but ash. Then I saw hands of light intervening, halting the destruction before it could claim more lives. But each time the intervention came, the consequences twisted into something worse. I woke drenched in sweat. The images seared into my mind. When I arrived at the facility later that morning, Elias was waiting with a new report. Nemeris had shifted her behavior once more. This time, she had drawn not equations, but images, complex diagrams that looked disturbingly like maps. One of them bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Vatican itself. I visited her cell immediately, but she didn't look up from her work. "You're beginning to see," she said without prompting, as though she had been expecting me. "What are you waiting for?" I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. She paused, meeting my gaze through the thick glass. "For someone to understand that we are not here to save you," she said softly. "We are here to remind you of what happens when you demand salvation instead of earning it." Her words struck something deep within me. I wanted to press her for more, but I sensed she had already given me everything she was willing to share. I left her cell with a growing weight in my chest, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form an unsettling picture. That afternoon, I began writing my formal report. It was unlike any document I had ever submitted in my career. I wrote that the residents were not prisoners but volunteers, that their presence served as a test, a lesson for humanity about the dangers of seeking easy solutions. I knew the Vatican would resist these conclusions. They had built an entire system of control around the idea that these beings were dangerous. But I couldn't deny the truth any longer. As I typed, the faint echo of Raphael's humming drifted through the facility, threading through every corridor like a call that only those inside could truly hear. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the world above to finally ask the right questions. Departure. Music. The report was submitted, and I knew it would cause shock among Vatican officials. I detailed my findings with precision. The beings were not captives, but participants in a voluntary arrangement meant to protect humanity from its own dependence on divine intervention. They were not dangerous, but their knowledge, if misused, could be catastrophic. Days passed with no response. Then, Cardinal Armand arrived at the facility with a delegation of senior authorities. Their presence filled the observation deck with tension. He held my report in his hand, his expression grave. "Your assessment is troubling," he said. "You suggest releasing beings who could reshape the world." I met his stare calmly. "I'm suggesting you accept that they were never imprisoned. Their continued presence here depends entirely on our understanding of why they came." Silence followed, thick and suffocating. before the cardinal finally nodded for the discussions to begin. The Vatican. Officials spent hours reviewing every detail. They interviewed Dr. Elias, interrogated the guard captains, and examined the surveillance footage I had provided. They scrutinized every piece of evidence, searching for flaws in my conclusions. I remained on the observation deck, watching the residents in their quiet routines. Nemorous tracing equations, Bronick folding his fragile stars, Gabriel calmly reading his book. It all seemed unchanged, yet the air felt heavier than ever. Finally, Cardinal Armand returned. The weight of the decision etched into his features. "The Vatican accepts your assessment," he said. "We will no longer treat them as prisoners, but as honored guests. We will respect their terms and allow them to choose when to leave." Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by a sense that something irreversible was about to happen. "And if they choose to go?" I asked. "Then they will go," he replied quietly. That evening I stood in the observation deck, addressing the residents through the facility's intercom system. My voice trembled as I spoke. "The Vatican has acknowledged the truth. You are free to leave whenever you wish, but you are welcome to stay as long as you desire." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Namis rose from the floor of her cell and stepped forward. Her voice, clear and resonant, filled the entire facility despite the soundproofing. "Our work here is complete. Humanity has learned to ask the right questions and accept difficult answers. We will depart at midnight." I gripped the edge of the console as the reality of her words sank in. The residents who had been here for centuries, who had shaped my understanding of the world in a matter of weeks, were leaving, and there was nothing I could do but witness it. As the final hour approached, I remained in the observation deck, unable to tear my eyes from the cells. One by one, the residents began to fade, dissolving into light as though their very essence was returning to some greater whole. Each departure felt like a subtle severing. Inside my mind, a presence quietly withdrawing. Some stayed long enough to complete final tasks. Bronick folded one last origami star and placed it delicately on his table before vanishing. The woman who painted murals added a final detail to her artwork, her brush strokes deliberate and graceful. Gabriel closed his book and left it resting on his bed, perhaps as a message for those who would come after. The last to leave was Nemais. She approached her window and wrote one final message on the floor. "Thank you for understanding." Then she too dissolved into radiant light. When morning came, the facility was silent. The cells stood empty and the atmosphere felt different, hollow, yet peaceful. I drafted my final report and handed in my resignation. The Vatican offered me other assignments, acknowledging my ability to handle extraordinary circumstances, but I declined. My work here was done. The underground complex was later converted into a research center where scientists studied the mathematical formulas, artistic creations, and musical compositions the residents had left behind. Their work would inspire humanity for generations, but the purpose behind it would remain known only to a few. I returned to my former career in corrections, dealing with human prisoners and their alto-human struggles. Yet I carried with me the lessons learned in that hidden place beneath the earth. The memory of their departure never left me. Sometimes late at night I would wonder where they had gone and whether other worlds had similar sanctuaries. Perhaps other species were being taught the same lesson about growth and the necessity of failure. I found myself quoting Nemesi's final words often, even if I could never explain their origin. The greatest gift humanity possesses, she had said, is its ability to fail and to learn from failure. Struggle builds strength in ways that ease never can. We care for you too deeply to deprive you of that truth. I believed those words with all my heart. For the first time in my life, I understood that true wisdom cannot be given. It must be earned. And so I moved forward, knowing the universe was full of unseen teachers waiting patiently for their lessons to take root.